Hello, everyone, and welcome to what will be, if everything goes according to plan, our last fill-in video for the Gospel of Luke. From here on out, I believe, again, if everything goes as planned, we will be going consecutively through the rest of the Gospel of Luke, leading us through the end of November. Of course, we are getting to more and more intense stuff, and it becomes more and more important that we connect all the dots as we go through this week of Passover and watching Jesus' ministry leading up to the cross and the resurrection. So we have one last little bit to cover to be ready for church on Sunday morning, and it's in chapter 20, going from verse 20 through the very beginning of chapter 21. So Jesus has just told the parable of the wicked vine dressers. He's talked about the cornerstone and the stone falling on them and crushing them to powder. That was last week. And it says that they sought to lay hands on him, but they feared the people, for they knew he had spoken this parable against them. So they know that when the crowds are around, they cannot arrest Jesus without a really good reason to, or the crowd it would be a mob. And so that's one of the things it says that the Roman officials are concerned about during the Passover week too. And part of the reason Jesus is crucified is they're worried about an uprising. They're worried about chaos in the streets of Jerusalem. So the religious leaders know they can't get him in public without good reason, which is why eventually they get him in private, because they try to trap him in public and they're unable to do so, as they have been so many times before. And that's what we're going to see as we're getting into chapter 20, verse 20. So here we go. And for the last time, I guess I'll say, reading from the New King James, you read from whatever you want. Well, maybe not whatever you want, but from a decent translation. Okay. Verse 20. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be righteous, that they might seize on his words in order to deliver him to the power and the authority of the governor. Then they asked him, saying, "Teacher, we know that you say and teach rightly, and you do not show personal favoritism, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Why are they asking this? Well, they're hoping that Jesus is going to say, no, you shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar because God's kingdom is greater and they shouldn't be ruling over us. And if Jesus says don't pay taxes, then they're going to go straight to the governor and they're going to say, guess what? And they're going to get the Romans to arrest Jesus. So now that's the tactic here. Verse 23, but he perceived their craftiness and said to them, "Why do you test me? Show me a denarius. Whose image and inscription does it have?" They answered and said, "Caesar's." And he said to them, "Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." But they could not catch him in his words in the presence of the people, and they marveled at his answer and kept silent. Once again, they just don't get it. But I think one important thing to point out here, other than the fact that obviously Jesus is saying if you owe taxes, you should pay them. The bigger picture is Jesus consistently throughout Scripture, throughout his ministry, is trying to get his disciples, and ultimately us, to understand the difference between these kingdoms here, which for them is Rome, for us, United States of America, or wherever you may live if you're abroad, but the kingdoms here are not his kingdom which is coming. Okay, that's over and over and over again. We're going to talk extensively about that this weekend in the sermon. And so our hope and trust needs to be in his kingdom, not in this kingdom. But his point here is, well, I mean, money, that belongs to the government. So give it back to the government. That's not a concern here. So they couldn't catch him. Too wise, too smart. Didn't have anything to accuse him on, which is why eventually they have to get him in private because they can't get him in public. So the Pharisees took their try. And remember, we talked about this weekend. If you think about the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders as being like the three branches of our government, executive, judicial, legislative, think of the Pharisees and the Sadducees like the political parties, Republican, Democrat. And you have the Pharisees who have their beliefs on certain doctrines or how they should interact with the Roman authorities, for example. And you have the Sadducees who have their opinions. And so these actually are two of their biggest differences that we're about to see. The Sadducees are about to come ask a question about the resurrection. Sadducees believe there was no resurrection, okay, no sort of afterlife, if you want to think of it that way. And they believed that you should submit to the Roman authority and that the path to power and influence was to be involved with and appease the Roman authority. The Pharisees, on the other hand, they believed that there was a resurrection and afterlife. They believed that the Jews should oppose the Roman authority and the government. So you had these two parties who disagreed. I'm not making finger guns on purpose, but it kind of ended up being finger guns. So they oppose one another, and their questions relate to their disagreements. So they're trying to see which side Jesus is going to pick. That's part of this too. So, all right, verse 27. Then some of the Sadducees, who deny that there's a resurrection, there it is, that's important, came to him and asked him, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote to us that if a man's brother dies having a wife, and he dies without children, his brother should take his wife and raise up offspring for his brother. And the second, missed a verse there. Now, here's their scenario. Now there were 7 brothers. Okay, so I think this is funny. They're positing a sort of ridiculous hypothetical situation here to see if they can catch Jesus. This is what people often do to try and defeat an ideology. You take it to the furthest degree and say, is the furthest degree true? If the furthest degree is not true, then the principle must then not be true. It's a sort of philosophical game in a way. And as a little aside, my son loves doing little things like this. JD, he's never-endingly coming up with a new trolley problem. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's like you've got 2 tracks, and you have the control of the switch to the track, and on this track is 10 innocent people that you don't know, and on this track is your mother or something. Which way do it's these sort of philosophical games of ethics or whatever else. And so he's always coming up with new ones. Well, that's kind of what they're doing here. They're saying, all right, here's this crazy situation. How does this play out? So there are 7 brothers, and the first took a wife and died without children. And the second took her as wife, and he died childless. Then the third took her, and in like manner the 7 also. And they left no children and died. Last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife does she become? For all 7 had her as wife. You see what's happening. Jesus answered and said to them, The sons of this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are counted worthy to attain that age and the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, nor can they die anymore. For they are equal to the angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. And let me just pause and make this clear. It could sound like what Jesus is saying is that those who are worthy won't get married now. That's not what he's saying, because he says, nor can they die anymore. Otherwise, he would be saying that those people are now, immortal. They can't die. So what he's saying, I know this is not popular. I know we don't like those of us that are married and we love our spouse. We don't like to hear this, but in the resurrection, there is no need for marriage. And it's not that you won't love your spouse and be devoted to them and love them deeply more than anyone else. It's just that marriage is not necessary. And so he said it's a moot point. It's not a moot point, a moot point to even ask this. Verse 37, but even Moses showed in the burning bush passage that the dead are raised when he called the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. For he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they're all still alive. So he's the God of them. All right, verse 39. Then some of the scribes answered and said, Teacher, you have spoken well. But after that, they dared not question him anymore. And he said to them, so now he has a question for them, verse 41. How can they say that the Christ is the son of David? That's what they all would have said. It's, in fact, in Matthew, he gives us a little more detail. And Matthew tells us that Jesus asked the question. He said, what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? And they say, well, he's the son of David. That's what Scripture tells. And Jesus says, well, how could he be the son of David? Now, David himself said in the book of Psalms, this is Psalm 110, it's the most quoted psalm in the New Testament. David said himself, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. Therefore, David calls him Lord. And that psalm is understood to be the Father speaking to the Son, or they wouldn't have understood it that way, but the Father speaking to the Christ, okay? So the Father speaking to the Christ in heaven, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. Therefore, David calls him Lord. How is he then his son? How could he be, because the son of David means a descendant of David, that means the person is human. How could he be human and God at the same time? Chew on that for a little while. That's what he says to them. Then, verse 45, in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, beware of the scribes. And so this may have been Pharisees and Sadducees, both of these that came to him asking these questions. They may have been scribes. So he's lumping them together as experts in the law. Beware of the scribes who desire to go around in long robes, love greetings in the marketplaces, the best seats in the synagogues, and the best places at feasts, who devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive greater condemnation. So Jesus says, watch out for these people. Watch out for these people that use power for their own gain. They're more concerned about themselves and this kingdom than they are about Christ and his. That is absolutely true. And then the next 4 verses in chapter 21, I'm also going to read. I think these belong better in chapter 20 because this is clearly a contrast to what he just said about the scribes. It's very intentional and very clearly intentional. So I think those should be combined together. So just the first 4 verses of chapter 21, and then we'll pick up with verse 5 on Sunday. And he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw also a certain poor widow putting in 2 mites. So he said, truly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all. For all these out of their abundance had put in offerings for God, but she out of her poverty put in all the livelihood that she had. And he's providing that, he's pointing that out as a contrast to these religious leaders, these scribes, Pharisees and Sadducees, these scribes who are going and they're doing everything they're doing so that they will get attention, so they will get power, so they will get acclaim, self-glory. And he wants them to see the difference. He's put them in their place. He wants them to see the difference. And then in the next passage, what we're going to talk about on Sunday, he's going to talk about exactly what's coming next. So we'll see you on Sunday morning.